The dust kicked up as the old pickup truck rolled down the quiet street of Pine Creek. The man behind the wheel had dark skin weathered by years under foreign suns. His eyes moved constantly, checking mirrors, scanning rooftops, habits that don't die even when the war is over. This was Thomas Carter, back in his hometown after 15 years away. The neighborhood had changed. New houses stood where empty lots once were. The corner store was now a coffee shop, but the air still smelled the same, like cut grass and coming rain. Thomas parked in front of a small blue house with a wraparound porch. He sat for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel, before turning to his only companion. "Well, Rex, this is it. Home sweet home." The German shepherd in the passenger seat perked up his ears. Rex wasn't just any dog. The special vest he wore marked him as a service animal, but to Thomas he was much more. They had survived 3 tours together. Twice, Rex had found hidden explosives that would have killed Thomas and his team. Once, the dog had dragged Thomas to safety after a mission went wrong, pulling him through dirt and blood while bullets flew overhead. Thomas reached over and scratched behind Rex's ears. "Just you and me now, buddy." The key felt strange in his hand as he unlocked the front door. His uncle had left him this house, which was the only reason he'd come back to Pine Creek. Thomas needed quiet. He needed space to figure out who he was without a gun in his hand. Inside, dust covers protected old furniture. Thomas walked through rooms filled with memories, some good, some that made his jaw tighten. He'd grown up here after his parents died, raised by an uncle who taught him respect and hard work. The same uncle who'd cried when Thomas joined the army at 18, seeking something he couldn't find in this small town. Rex sniffed every corner, marking his territory in this new place, while Thomas unpacked the few things he owned. His medals stayed in their box, tucked away in the bottom of his duffel bag. The nightmares they brought with them came free of charge. By evening, Thomas sat on the porch, watching the street as neighbors returned from work. They noticed him. How could they not? New faces were rare in Pine Creek, and a black man sitting alone drew looks whether people meant to stare or not. Mrs. Wilson from across the street was the first to approach, bringing a pie like people still did in places like this. "You must be Jeff's nephew," she said, hesitating at the bottom step. Rex came to the screen door, and her eyes widened. "Don't worry about him," Thomas said, his voice rough from not using it much. "He's friendlier than I am." She laughed then, climbing the steps. "Your uncle talked about you all the time. Said you were doing important work." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak about the important work that woke him sweating most nights. Instead, he accepted the pie and traded small talk until she left. More neighbors came by as the week passed. Thomas fixed his fence, mowed the lawn, and kept to himself. He answered questions with nods when possible. No, he didn't want to talk about where he'd served. Yes, the dog was well trained. No, he wasn't married. What he didn't tell them, that he'd been Delta Force, one of the military's most elite units. That the things he'd done for his country were classified so deeply that most of his missions didn't officially exist. That Rex had saved more American lives than anyone would ever know. Thomas didn't notice the police cruiser that drove by his house 3 times that first week. Didn't see the officers inside watching him with narrowed eyes as he worked in his yard with Rex always nearby. He was too busy trying to remember how to live in a world where threats didn't hide around every corner, where the sound of a car backfiring shouldn't make him reach for a weapon that wasn't there anymore. But old habits die hard, and Thomas kept his doors locked and his eyes open. Pine Creek was supposed to be his fresh start, his quiet place to heal. He didn't know yet that the real war was about to begin right here on American soil. Thomas woke before sunrise the way he always did. Old habits from years of early morning missions stayed with him even now. Rex stretched beside the bed, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor. The morning routine was simple: a 5-mile run through the neighborhood, breakfast for both of them, then coffee on the porch while the town came alive. "Need to grab some groceries today, buddy," Thomas said as he filled Rex's water bowl. The dog's tail wagged at the sound of his voice. "You'll be okay in the yard for 20 minutes. Thomas checked the fence one more time before leaving. It was solid. He'd fixed every weak spot himself. Rex had his shade tree, fresh water, and his favorite chew toy. The special vest that marked him as a service animal hung by the door. Rex didn't need it in his own yard. "Be back soon," Thomas promised, scratching behind Rex's ears. The dog licked his hand once, then trotted over to lie down under the oak tree. The drive to the store was quick. Thomas grabbed just what he needed: eggs, coffee, dog food, and some fruit. He paid cash, another old habit, and headed back home. 15 minutes tops. Nothing could go wrong in 15 minutes. But as he turned onto his street, he saw them. 2 police cruisers parked at odd angles in front of his house. His heart rate jumped, muscle memory kicking in from too many ambushes in too many dangerous places. Thomas parked across the street watching. Officer Reed stood by his car, writing something on a clipboard. The other cop, Officer Patterson, according to his nameplate, was on his radio. Neither seemed to be in a hurry. Neither seemed concerned. Then Thomas saw the blood on the grass. He was out of his truck before he even realized he was moving. Grocery bags forgotten. "Where's my dog?" The words came out quiet. "Dangerous." Officer Reed looked up, surprised. "This your place? We got a call about a dangerous animal." Thomas moved toward his gate, but Patterson stepped in front of him. "Sir, you need to stay back." "Where is my dog?" Thomas repeated, his voice still eerily calm. "The animal was aggressive when we approached," Reed said, not looking Thomas in the eye. "Had to be put down for public safety." The world went silent for Thomas. Through the gate, he could see Rex's body, lying still in a pool of blood by the back steps. 3 bullet holes. The dog hadn't even made it to the fence. "He was in a fenced yard," Thomas said. "He was a trained service animal." Patterson shrugged. "Didn't see no special vest." "Got a complaint about a vicious dog," we responded. Thomas noticed things his military training wouldn't let him ignore. The way Patterson's hand kept touching his gun, the slight smile at the corner of Reed's mouth, the empty beer cans in their cruiser visible through the open window. "I want your badge numbers," Thomas said, "and I want the body cam footage." Reed laughed then, a short, ugly sound. "Body cams were malfunctioning today. Technical issue, and you might want to watch your tone." "We got a call," we responded. "Dog was aggressive." End of story. "Wouldn't be the first dangerous animal in this neighborhood," Patterson added, looking directly at Thomas. The threat hung in the air between them. Thomas had faced down terrorists who looked at him with less hatred than these officers. "I'm going to bury my dog now," Thomas said, each word precise. "Then I'm going to file a report." "Good luck with that," Reed snorted. "Chief Johnson's an old hunting buddy of mine, but you go ahead and try." They left him there, laughing as they drove away. Thomas stood for a long time, looking at Rex's body through the fence. The dog had survived war zones, had protected Thomas from hidden enemies, had slept beside him through nightmares that left him screaming. And now he was gone, killed for fun by men who were supposed to protect and serve. Thomas dug the grave himself, behind the oak tree Rex had liked to lie under. He wrapped the dog in his favorite blanket. His hands didn't shake, his eyes stayed dry. But something inside him had changed. The quiet man who wanted peace was gone now. In his place stood a soldier again, one with a new mission. The police station smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. Thomas sat in a hard plastic chair, his back straight, waiting. He'd been there for 2 hours already. The desk sergeant had taken his complaint with a bored expression, promising someone would get to it when they could. 3 days had passed since they'd killed Rex. 3 days of a quiet house that felt wrong. No clicking of nails on the floor. No warm body leaning against his leg during thunderstorms. Just silence and anger that burned cold. "Mr. Carter." A heavy-set man in uniform finally approached. "I'm Lieutenant Brooks. I understand you want to file a complaint." Thomas followed him to a small office with peeling paint and outdated computers. He told his story simply. No emotion, just facts. Rex in the yard. The fence secure. The officer's behavior. The 3 bullets. "And you say the dog was a service animal?" Brooks asked, typing slowly with 2 fingers. "Yes, for PTSD. I have the paperwork." Thomas slid the folder across the desk. "And I want to see the body cam footage." Brooks barely glanced at the documents. "Unfortunately, there was a technical issue with the cameras that day. But I assure you, our officers are well trained. If they felt threatened." My dog was inside a fence, Thomas interrupted. He was shot 3 times, in the back. Brooks leaned back in his chair. Look, these things happen. Animals can be unpredictable. File your complaint if you want, but between us, nothing's going to come of it. Thomas left with a case number and a hollow feeling. That night, he called a lawyer from the phone book. The lawyer's office was nicer than the police station, with leather chairs and framed diplomas on the wall. The woman behind the desk, Miss Taylor, listened more carefully than Lieutenant Brooks had. Without the body cam footage, it's your word against theirs, she said finally. And in this town, well, let's just say the relationship between the police department and the courts is friendly. There must be something we can do, Thomas insisted. She tapped her pen against her legal pad. We can file a civil suit. It won't bring your dog back, but you might get some financial compensation. I don't want money. I want accountability. Ms. Taylor sighed. That's much harder to get, Mr. Carter. Thomas tried anyway. He wrote to the mayor. He spoke at a town council meeting where people shifted uncomfortably in their seats and avoided his eyes. He contacted the local newspaper, but the reporter who met with him said his editor wouldn't run the story. Too sensitive, he explained with an apologetic shrug. A month passed. The complaint disappeared into a filing system designed to lose things. His lawsuit stalled before it began, blocked by procedural delays and missing paperwork. Then came the final blow. Thomas was shopping when he saw the newspaper in the rack by the register. Officer Reed smiled from the front page, accepting an award for bravery. The article praised him for protecting the neighborhood from a dangerous animal last month. Thomas stared at the paper for a long time. The cashier had to ask twice for his money. That night, he sat on his porch in the dark. Across the street, Mrs. Wilson was walking her small poodle. She waved hesitantly, but didn't come over like she used to. None of the neighbors did anymore. They'd all read the newspaper. They'd all chosen sides. Thomas went inside and opened the closet where he'd stored his military footlocker. He hadn't looked inside since coming home. Hadn't wanted to remember. Now he unlocked it and lifted the lid. His past lay there, neatly packed away. Photos of his team, specialized equipment. A satellite phone that still worked. A book of contacts, people who owed him their lives. Thomas picked up his old tactical notebook and a pen. He tried to do things the right way. The legal way. The peaceful way. They'd left him no choice. He began to write, making lists, drawing diagrams. Planning an operation not against enemies in a foreign land, but against corruption in his own backyard. This time he wouldn't fail. Thomas's basement had become something else entirely. Maps of Pine Creek covered one wall, with red pins marking police patrol routes. A timeline of Officer Reed's shifts took up another wall. Thomas had been watching, learning patterns, gathering intel like he'd done in countries whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. He'd stopped trying to blend in. What was the point? The neighbors crossed the street when they saw him coming. Kids were called inside when he stepped onto his porch. The word had spread. Dangerous man, troublemaker, not one of us. Fine. He would be what they already thought he was. Thomas checked his watch and picked up his secure phone. Military habits died hard. Exactly 2100 hours. Time for the call. Hey, brother, came the voice on the other end. No names, even on secure lines. Old habits. You still good for next week? Thomas asked. Wouldn't miss it. Been too long since our last reunion. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. Bring the equipment we talked about. Already packed, and I'm not coming alone. Hawk and Ghost send their regards. Thomas hadn't expected that. Hawk was their old communications specialist. Ghost had been their surveillance expert, the best in the business at staying invisible while watching everything. They don't need to get involved in this, Thomas said. A laugh came through the phone. Try stopping them. We saw the news, brother. We know what happened to Rex. You think we'd let you handle this alone? After the call ended, Thomas sat in silence for a long time. He'd planned to do this himself, keep his old team out of it, but a part of him, the part that had led men into the world's most dangerous places, knew he needed them. This wasn't about revenge. Thomas had seen too much death to think more violence would fix anything. This was about justice, about exposing the truth. and for that, he needed evidence no one could ignore or bury. The doorbell rang 3 days later, just after midnight. Thomas had been expecting it, but still approached cautiously, gun in hand. Old habits. 3 shadows stood on his porch. He recognized them instantly, even in darkness. The way they stood, the way they moved. Brothers not by blood, but by something stronger. "Commander," the tallest one said with a mock salute as Thomas opened the door. "Don't call me that," Thomas replied, but he was smiling as he pulled the man into a rough hug. "Good to see you, Walker." The other 2 men, Rodriguez and Chen, carried heavy duffel bags that clanked with equipment as they stepped inside. "Home sweet home," Rodriguez said, looking around the living room. "Nice place for retirement. Shame about the neighbors." They gathered around Thomas's kitchen table as he laid out what he knew. The corruption wasn't just Officer Reed and his partner. It went up the chain. The police chief, the mayor, even the local judge, all connected, all protecting each other. "This isn't what I thought civilian life would be," Chen said quietly. "Coming home to find this kind of garbage." Walker nodded. "What's the mission parameters? You want these guys taken out?" His tone was casual, like he was asking about dinner plans. Thomas shook his head firmly. "No, we're not here to hurt anyone." "After what they did to Rex," Rodriguez started. "We're soldiers, not murderers," Thomas cut in. "We're going to expose them. Get enough evidence that even their friends can't ignore it." He tapped the map. "We need surveillance on these locations. We need to document everything they do." Chen grinned, pulling equipment from his bag. "Like the old days, except now we're hunting dirty cops instead of terrorists." "Not much difference sometimes," Walker muttered. For the next 3 days, they transformed the basement into an operations center. Chen set up surveillance cameras so small they could be hidden in tree branches. Rodriguez configured communication systems that couldn't be intercepted. Walker prepared disguises and backstories for infiltration. And Thomas watched them work, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders for the first time since Rex died. He wasn't alone anymore. He had his team back. Men who understood duty and loyalty in ways civilians never could. "They won't know what hit them," Chen said, testing a directional microphone. Thomas nodded. "They think they're hunters. They don't realize they're about to become the hunted." The first week of surveillance yielded nothing extraordinary. Just normal police work, traffic stops, responding to calls, paperwork. Thomas began to wonder if he'd been wrong about the scale of corruption. Then came Tuesday night. Walker was positioned in a tree across from the abandoned warehouse at the edge of town. The place had once been a furniture factory before jobs dried up and businesses left. Through his night vision scope, he watched 2 police cruisers pull up. Officers Reed and Patterson stepped out, followed by Chief Wilson himself. "We've got activity," Walker whispered into his comm. 3 targets, main entrance. Thomas, listening from their makeshift command center in his basement, felt his pulse quicken. "Chen, you in position?" "Affirmative," came the response. Chen was hiding behind some old crates inside the warehouse, having snuck in hours earlier. His small cameras were already recording. They watched as the officers carried duffel bags inside. 15 minutes later, a black SUV with tinted windows arrived. A man in an expensive suit got out. "That's Judge Harris," Thomas noted, recognizing him from newspaper photos. "What's a judge doing at an abandoned warehouse at midnight?" Rodriguez adjusted his directional microphone, picking up their conversation inside. The audio quality was perfect. His equipment was military grade, better than anything these small-town officials would expect. What they heard shocked even Thomas, who thought he'd seen the worst of humanity in war zones. The duffel bags contained drugs and cash seized in recent arrests. Cases that had mysteriously disappeared from the evidence room. Money that never made it into official reports. The judge was there to collect his share and provide court dates for the next batch of targeted arrests. "They choosing who to arrest based on who has cash or drugs worth taking," Rodriguez said, disgust evident in his voice. "And look who they're targeting," Thomas added as they reviewed the list of names being discussed. "All from the poorer parts of town. All minorities." Over the next 2 weeks, they gathered more evidence. Officer Reed planting drugs in a teenager's car. Patterson beating a handcuffed man behind the station while Chief Wilson watched. The judge dismissing cases against friends while maximizing sentences for others. They're not even trying to hide it, Chen said as they reviewed the footage. They think no one's watching. Thomas nodded grimly. They've gotten away with it for so long, they feel untouchable. The turning point came when they recorded a conversation between Reed and the chief in the police station parking lot. Chen had placed a tiny camera on a streetlight the night before. "That dog thing's still bothering you?" the chief asked, lighting a cigarette. Reed laughed. "Nah, just some mutt. But you should have seen that guy's face when he came home. Priceless." "Any trouble from him?" "He tried filing a complaint. Brooks buried it." Reed shrugged. "What's he gonna do? He's just another." The slur that followed made even Walker, who rarely showed emotion, clench his fists. The chief chuckled. "Well, good work anyway. Send a message to the neighborhood. We decide who belongs here." Thomas watched the recording 3 times, his face expressionless. Then he turned to his team. "We've got enough. Time for phase 2. Rodriguez looked up from his laptop. "You sure? We could get more." "We have what we need," Thomas replied. "Reed, Patterson, the chief, the judge. We've got them on video breaking at least 15 laws. Time to make it public." They chose a reporter from the neighboring town's newspaper, a young woman known for exposing corruption in her own community. Thomas approached her carefully, using an anonymous email account Chen had set up. She was skeptical at first, until they sent her a small sample of what they had. "This is incredible," she said when they finally met in person at a diner 30 miles from Pine Creek. Her eyes were wide as she reviewed the files. "How did you get all this?" Thomas exchanged glances with Walker. "Let's just say we have specialized training." "People need to see this," she said, already typing notes. "All of it." "That's the plan," Thomas replied. "But there's one more piece we need to get, and it's the most dangerous one yet." The FBI agent's car sat on the table between them. Thomas had been saving this call as a last resort. It was time. The first article hit the newspaper on a Sunday morning. By noon, the story had spread to 3 neighboring towns. By evening, a regional TV station picked it up. TORUPTIN in Pine Creek ran across screens in living rooms throughout the county. Thomas watched from his window as cars slowed down passing his house. People were talking. Things were happening. The reporter had done exactly what she promised, published everything except the source of the information. The police department issued immediate denials, calling the evidence fabricated and threatening lawsuits, but the videos spoke for themselves. "They're panicking," Walker said, monitoring police radio frequencies. Chief called an emergency meeting at the station. Thomas nodded. "And now we wait." The FBI agent, a straight-talking woman named Agent Lee, had been cautious when Thomas first contacted her. But after reviewing their evidence, she'd moved quickly, opening an official investigation. "Keep your heads down," she'd warned. "These people are cornered now. That makes them dangerous." She was right. Just after midnight, Thomas's security system picked up movement at the edge of his property. Silent figures moving through the shadows toward his house. 4 targets approaching from the south, Chen reported from his position upstairs. "It's Reed and Patterson, plus 2 others in civilian clothes." Thomas checked the thermal imaging screen. "They're armed." Walker looked at him. "Rules of engagement." "Non-lethal only," Thomas replied firmly. "We're not killers." "They might not give us the same courtesy," Rodriguez pointed out. Thomas checked his watch. "Agent Lee's team is 20 minutes out. We just need to hold them until then." They moved to their positions. This part of the plan had always been a possibility. Desperate men making desperate choices. Thomas had prepared for it. The first officer tried the back door, finding it unlocked. Too easy, he signaled the others forward. As they crept into the dark kitchen, Thomas watched from his hidden position. These men had come to his home to silence him, to make him disappear. They'd killed his dog without hesitation. What would they do to a man who threatened their whole corrupt system? Officer Reed took 2 steps into the living room before triggering the first trap. A motion sensor activated, and suddenly the floor was slick with cooking oil. Reed went down hard, his gun skittering across the floor. What there? Patterson started. Before the automated system, Thomas had rigged sprayed pepper spray from concealed nozzles. The two men in civilian clothes backed toward the door, coughing and disoriented. One of them, Thomas recognized the police department's lawyer, reached for his weapon. "I wouldn't," came Walker's voice from the darkness, the red dot of his laser sight steady on the man's chest. Within 3 minutes, all 4 intruders were subdued, no shots fired, no blood spilled. Just 4 corrupt officials zip-tied on Thomas's living room floor, surrounded by the very equipment they'd come to destroy. "You think this changes anything?" Reed spat, blood from his split lip dotting his chin. "We run this town. Always have." Thomas crouched down to look him in the eye. "Not anymore." He held up his phone, showing the live video feed being transmitted to Agent Lee's team. "Everything that just happened is being recorded. Breaking and entering. Attempted assault. Maybe even attempted murder. That's on top of everything else we caught you doing." Patterson struggled against his restraints. "You set us up." "No," Thomas replied calmly. "You did this to yourselves. I just made sure everyone could see it." The sound of vehicles approaching made the intruders go pale. Flashing lights reflected through the windows as FBI agents surrounded the house. Agent Lee entered first, surveying the scene with raised eyebrows. "I see you've been busy, Mr. Carter." Thomas nodded toward the men on the floor. They seemed eager to have a conversation about those videos. As the agents led the 4 men away, Lee pulled Thomas aside. "You know what you did was dangerous, and technically illegal." "So was killing my dog," Thomas replied. "Will there be charges?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Against them?" "Absolutely." "Against you and your team?" "Let's just say the Bureau appreciates citizens who help expose corruption, especially citizens with your particular skill set." Thomas watched through the window as the cars drove away, taking with them the men who'd thought themselves above the law. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time since Rex died, Thomas felt something like peace. Summer turned to fall as Pine Creek faced its reckoning. Thomas sat in the back row of the courtroom, watching as Officer Reed took the stand. In the 3 months since that night at Thomas's house, the small town had been turned upside down. 12 police officers indicted. The chief resigned in disgrace. The mayor, caught on tape accepting bribes, followed soon after. Judge Harris, the man who had helped cover up countless injustices, now faced justice himself. Thomas listened as Reed tried to explain away his actions. The excuses sounded hollow in the quiet courtroom. "And on the day in question, did you shoot a service animal belonging to a decorated veteran?" the prosecutor asked. Reed shifted in his seat. "The dog was aggressive." "That's not what your own bodycam shows," the prosecutor replied, nodding to the technician. The footage played on screens throughout the courtroom, footage Thomas had never seen. The FBI had recovered it from the department's servers despite attempts to delete it. There was Rex, wagging his tail behind the fence. There was Reed, laughing as he raised his gun. "Watch this," he said to Patterson. 3 shots. The dog never even barked. Thomas closed his eyes. After all this time, seeing it happen was almost too much to bear. A hand rested on his shoulder. Walker, sitting beside him. Chen and Rodriguez were there too, all 3 men having stayed in town, despite Thomas's insistence that they could go home. "We finish missions together," Walker had said simply. Outside the courthouse after the verdict, guilty on all counts, reporters swarmed around Thomas. "How does it feel to know justice has been served?" one asked, shoving a microphone toward him. Thomas thought for a moment. "It's not about feeling good," he said finally. "It's about doing what's right. Sometimes that's all we have." The town meeting the following week was packed. People who had avoided Thomas for months now nodded respectfully as he entered. The acting mayor, a retired schoolteacher who had won a special election, called the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss the police reform bill," she announced. "Mr. Carter, would you like to speak about the proposal?" Thomas walked to the podium, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. He wasn't used to speaking publicly. In the military, he let his actions do the talking. But some things needed to be said out loud. "This bill isn't just about body cameras that can't be turned off," he began. "It's not just about civilian oversight boards with real power. It's about who we want to be as a community." He looked around the room, at faces both familiar and not. Neighbors who had turned away from him, others who had quietly supported him. What happened to my dog shouldn't happen to anyone. But it wasn't just about Rex. It was about a system that protected the wrong people for the wrong reasons. The vote was unanimous. The bill passed and would be named after Rex. 1 week later, Thomas stood in the small park near his house. The place was crowded with people from town and neighboring communities. A small stone memorial had been placed under a young oak tree. It wasn't just for Rex anymore. It had become something bigger, a symbol of change. Thomas placed his hand on the cool stone as the new police chief, a woman brought in from outside to rebuild the department, unveiled the memorial's plaque. In memory of those who suffered injustice, she read, and in commitment to a future of equality and accountability. After the ceremony, Mrs. Wilson approached Thomas, her small poodle trotting beside her. "I'm sorry," she said simply, "for not believing you, for not standing with you." Thomas nodded. "We all have to find our courage somehow." As the crowd dispersed, Agent Lee walked over. "Quite a change you've brought to this town," she said. "The town did it," Thomas replied. "They just needed to see the truth." "And what about you?" she asked. "What now?" Thomas watched a group of children playing near the memorial without fear, without division. One of them, a boy about 10 years old, came running up. "Mr. Carter, can you come see our dog shelter project? It's for school." Thomas smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "I'd like that," he said. He reached into his pocket and touched Rex's old collar. He would always carry the pain of loss, but now there was something else too. Hope.